We are now going to kick off the first panel discussion, Accelerating the End of Hunger and Malnutrition by 2030 is the topic for discussion. If I could invite to the stage now, please, the panellists. Pak Subandi, who I think is here in the audience. Mr. Robert Gass, Stephen Rudgard, and Joost Nijhoff. Could you guys come to the stage, please, and take your seat, and we'll get started. We're around 10 minutes behind schedule, so we'll endeavour to make up a little bit of time throughout the course of this panel. You may sit anywhere. Right, microphone's working? Yep.
Yes, I'm on.
Okay. A very large question to start with, and the objective is obviously not to come up with any set conclusion. It's a broad topic. What I'd like to get from this discussion is really a sense of where these individuals and their expertise is thinking with regards to this question, the end of hunger and malnutrition to support SDG 2. And I will have some specific questions for all of you. I have no trick questions. They're simply questions to help the audience understand a little bit better what you're doing day to day here in Indonesia. By way of introduction, I think I'll just start on my right with Jan. If you could spend just 2 to 3 minutes introducing yourself, your organisation, and maybe an initiative that you're working on at the moment. Then I'll come back and I'll ask, in no particular order, a question of each of you, and I may give you the opportunity to ask questions of each other, and if we have time, we'll take 2 to 3 questions from the audience. So, Jan, if I'd like to kick off with you, introduce yourself, 2 to 3 minutes, and let's get this moving.
Thank you. So my name is Jan Nijhoff. I work for the World Bank, and I am the coordinator of everything to do with agriculture, the agricultural portfolio of the World Bank in Indonesia and in Timor-Leste also. So what keeps me busy on a daily basis? Our work has, basically there are 3 main things. Agricultural policy, dialogue, policy analysis, working very closely with BAPPENAS, with Bahjuri and his team, also with the Ministry of Agriculture, of course, and other stakeholders, for example, the Office of the President and other important institutions. And basically discussing many of the issues that we'll be talking about today. Secondly, we have, through investment lending, supported the agricultural research and development system, the agricultural research system in Indonesia, human capacity development, research, adaptive research and demand-driven research programs, as well as dissemination of technology. So that's the second theme. And the third one is kind of a multi-sectoral effort, both internally within our own office, but also with the government on sustainable landscape management. And we'll hear more about that from others later on. With a heavy focus on agriculture, sustainable agriculture in the lowlands of Indonesia, with a heavy focus on avoiding land degradation and doing things sustainably. Let me stop there.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you. Pak Subani Sajoko, would you like to introduce, well, I've introduced you, but tell us what you're up to. Just 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you, Tony. Apologize, anyone.
I think we need to put the microphone on.
Are you live?
I think that's working. Should be. Perhaps if it's not working, do you want to move to the podium? Do your...
Thank you, Tony. Just corrections, I'm not Subandi. Actually, I'm a replacement of Subandi because he was summoned by our ministers. My name is Pungkas Ali. I'm the director for community health and nutrition in BAPPENAS. My portfolio is dealing with all public health issues, starting from communal disease, non-communal disease, up to national health insurance as well as on the nutrition issues. And I think this is very interesting on the discussion today that we would like to discuss, especially these sessions on diet, which is very interesting in case of Indonesia because we have 3 problems on the diet, and then it will be very interesting if we can link it into sustainable agriculture because a lot of questions, a lot of things that need to resolve if we want to solve the problem of over and undernutrition, and those have quite different directions related to the what we call sustainable diets today. So my daily work is on doing the planning, both in medium-term plan, annual planning, but now also in BAPPENAS has also some power in terms of budgeting. Especially my partner is Food and Drug Agency and Ministry of Health. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And apologies, this agenda was printed 28 minutes ago and it's already out of date, so we might need to get an update. We might go to the end with Robert. Robert, a couple of minutes introduction.
Great. Selamat pagi, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. My name
Microphone also not working.
is there something we have to turn on? Or?
There we go.
I don't know. Is it?
It's on, I think.
Is it on?
Can you hear? Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe
My
move
name's
the
Robert.
mic closer to your mouth.
Okay.
That maybe. Actually, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. Is that okay now?
That's good.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Gas. I'm the Deputy Representative for UNICEF here in Indonesia. I've been here for a year, so still learning a little bit about the many fascinating possibilities and opportunities, and had the great pleasure to work with Pungkas over the past year, and been a great opportunity for learning. Nutrition is a major priority for UNICEF globally and in Indonesia. We currently are implementing activities both at national level in coordination and consultation with BAPPENAS, as well as in 7 field offices across the country. Our overall goal is to really strengthen the overall capacity to respond to all forms of malnutrition related to children. And I think the main areas that we work on is one is in terms of supporting the Scaling Up Nutrition Initiative, as well as the National Anti-Stunting Reduction Movement. Also doing a lot of work related to infant and young child feeding and strengthening nutritional outcomes for children as well as mothers, an adolescent nutrition program, and also addressing an emerging need, not just here in Indonesia, but in many parts across Southeast Asia and globally in terms of the rising levels of obesity among children to influence some fiscal and policy decisions.
Thank you, Robert, for your words. Now, Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself? 2 to 3 minutes.
Good morning. Salam alaikum. I've been FAO representative here in Indonesia now for 18 months. I feel I'm beginning a very long journey. The amount of knowledge that I've acquired is only a small fraction of what I need. But FAO has a big mandate here. We are very proud to be working with BAPPENAS on the context of food systems, policy and planning. Our mandate spans a broad range. We engage also with the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, and Ministry of Environment and Forestry, all of which have an impact on what we're discussing today around this broader context of food systems, moving from production through processing to retailing. That's something which the United Nations has traditionally focused in the past more on the production end. Now we're very happy to be looking at that whole food chain. Seeing how the transformation of the agriculture sector, the fishery sector has to really move. At the times we heard from His Excellency the broader scenario. We're happy to be engaging with RBCSD as well, and we feel that's a key partnership for us here. The old style UN has gone. We have to engage with the private sector as well as with government. So I'll finish there, but I think it's a proud moment. One more thing, just to remind everybody that wasn't aware, that the World Food Day theme this year was healthy diets. So we are absolutely on the spot. We celebrated on the weekend in Kendari, Southeast Sulawesi, with His Excellency, the new Minister of Agriculture and the Governor. This very, very important theme, and very happy to bring it forward here in this environment under the leadership of BAPPENAS.
Wonderful, Stephen. We might just, if it's okay, continue with you, Stephen. You're on a bit of a roll there, so let's continue. I have a question for you, and I'd like you to address this, based on your 18 months of experience and also your lengthy background in this particular area of food nutrition. What are the 5 key areas of transformation in the food value chain that the government, and you mentioned private sector, the private sector also need to address in the next 5 years? And how do we, and I think the key question is, how do they achieve these changes? What sort of initiatives and actions do we need to be taking? So what are the key areas, and how do we achieve that change in the next 5 years?
Thank you very much, Tony. You gave me a challenge of a number 5. I'll try and match the 5, but
3 is okay.
we'll see how we go. I think I'm going to start with the production side, because the value chain moves from the farmer's field to the plate. We're really looking at the context here of encouraging farmers, and our focus in the United Nations is more on smallholders and small farmers. They're the ones that are most challenged. They're the ones that proportionally occupy a lot of the ground on whatever commodity that you're looking at. And the challenge there is to get them to innovate. Business as usual, as we know from our discussions with BAPPENAS and with the sectoral ministries, business as usual is not an option. We need things like more effective plant breeding. We need better varieties to help small farmers raise their yields. We need smarter crop protection, maybe reducing the use of pesticides, but also reducing crop losses. That's a double challenge. Just talking today about reducing antibiotic use in animal production is a serious thing, but the private sector leads on that. The government can set the policies, but the private sector has to lead. So, and of course increasing mechanization given the demographic shift that we heard. The ministries have also been looking at resilience to shocks. We're currently dealing with an outbreak of fall armyworm, a pest that has flown all the way from Latin America through Africa, Asia, and arrived in Indonesia early this year. Nobody was prepared for this, and it's going to really challenge the maize production system throughout the country. So that resilience to shocks is really important. Plus, we're in a drought year. We have to look at conservation agriculture to maintain yields. I'm going to let my colleague Jan talk a little bit more about some of the aspects, but really what we're talking about here firstly is farmer livelihoods. We have to maintain small-scale farmer livelihoods and improve farming finances. The emphasis on production only has been put aside by the government. Farmer welfare and farmer economic health is definitely a real priority. So one key solution that we're looking at, I think, jointly with the government, is getting farmers to work together, especially for small farmers, either through formal cooperatives or associations, or what they call in Indonesia the inti plasma, the outgrower network, where you've got processors and off-takers taking products from groups of farmers. This enables those groups of farmers to be more innovative, to have a better commanding place in the market, to command a better price, both for national markets and for international markets. With the food value chain, moving from the farm gate to the plate, then we're talking about getting a better return to the farmer. We talked about consumer prices being high, but we're also looking at farm gate prices being low, and particularly for peak harvest periods where we've got perishable products. The minister has always said it's no good having the farmer receiving the bottom price and the consumer paying the top price. That doesn't work. To improve efficiencies in the value chain, particularly around reducing food waste, the government really knows that Indonesia is one of the worst countries in the world for food waste. Losses in terms of we need better packaging, better handling. We need to reduce the costs of transport. The distances involved are so huge. The transport network is diffuse, and there's no cold storage in the value chain, so things like 1 million chickens into Jakarta every day have to come alive and then be slaughtered here. So that whole process is really constraining that side of the value chain. We've got to look at food safety. We don't want to have contaminated food. And if you're moving perishable products, contamination is a serious issue. Plus, you've got to look at pesticide residues and other residues in food, not to mention microplastics in seafood, that these are things which the private sector's got to grapple with. The government can set the policy framework, but the private sector has to lead on that. But ultimately, family farming, and which is the other UN decade that we launched in May, the UN decade of family farming, launched jointly between IFAD and ourselves, that is the theme of what is going to put the fresh food on the plate of consumers. And the processes for getting it from the one to the other are really critical. And we heard that the government has that picture firmly in mind. And it's our pact now to work with the line ministries, the sectoral ministries that have to do that delivery, to make sure that food is accessible and affordable. That's the key double that we want, accessible and affordable. As well as, and one part of that is reducing food loss and waste. So I hope I've filled my time and generated a few ideas.
You have indeed, and a lot to do. Are you optimistic?
Oh yes.
Of course, of course. I think that you've actually framed up the discussion for Jan, perhaps to continue. The question, it's not really a question, it's sort of, I guess, a statement. How would you view or describe the high-level trends that are happening both here in Indonesia and globally at the moment, Jan?
Okay, so maybe we can take Stephen's value chain approach to the discussion, but then I'd like to start at the other end, on the demand side.
Yes.
And Parudi very eloquently, and I can't beat him to his presentation, has already shown us the trend, right? I mean, we've seen the demographics, we've seen population increase, and the urbanization he talked about, and that is the trend, and that is not just in Indonesia, that's around the world. And so you have urbanization, you have population growth, you also have income growth, and as a result of all that, you have changing diets, you have increasing expenditure to be spent on food, and what that is now looking at is, and this is actually research done by IFPRI recently, is a more diversified food system. And some key features there include proportionately less rice, for example, but disproportionately much more exponentially so, more processed foods and out-of-home eating. And that is what we have called the black box for ourselves, because we don't really know and we don't really understand what is happening in that box. But if you look at it graphically, and it's astonishing that that expenditure that is going to and is already happening there. And of course, that's where all the questions about diets come from, right? I mean, how healthy can that be? And how does that really change the value chains for all these different foods that eventually originate on a farm somewhere? Of course, then we have to take that as a given and say to ourselves, what then are the opportunities? Because this must present opportunities for some, for many in all these different value chains. And to repeat what Stephen said, the only way you can talk about that is by also including the private sector in the discussion. These are value chains that are going to have to be driven by private initiatives. So we need to then worry about probably what expansion potential is there, because we're talking about expansion of demand but also production. What about land availability? What about inter-island logistics, this being an archipelago, extremely important. Java's running out of land. It's, it's urbanizing slowly but surely. So what about that? Then perhaps consider just a few constraints before we move to some maybe concrete actions there. Of course, malnutrition, we all know about that. High stunting levels. Recent work that we've done basically identifies high food prices as a major issue. And it's a major issue that is not the only, but it is one of the contributors to malnutrition and undernutrition in Indonesia. Rice, okay, this is using data from a few years ago, but rice was 70% more expensive than in the Mekong Delta here in Indonesia. A food basket in Jakarta was almost double the price of a food basket in Delhi. And so high food prices caused by inefficiencies in markets, in the food system here, are causing problems. Trade policies are partly to blame for that, we think. Being part of that whole system that fuels inefficiencies in the system. And just to remind all of us that high food prices is not just good, is actually not good for farmers at all. 8% of households are net sellers of food. Almost 90% of households are net buyers. So even if you think you're going to get a high farm gate price, you still end up paying too much money for your own food that you have to buy. So another major oh yes, and what has now been empirically is you know, we're still working on this, but empirically proven that trade barriers do not only have an impact on food prices, a negative impact, but that also has a negative impact on nutritional intake. And there is a causality there, from one to the second to the third factor. So that's something to bear in mind when we think about the need for perhaps changing some of the policies. We have also low profitability, low labor productivity. The agriculture sector as a sector, in terms of labor productivity, sits at the bottom. And within the agricultural sector, food crops, rice for example, sits at the bottom of that. So there is a need to think about diversification, income generation, and perhaps alternative livelihoods as well. Of course, Bahjuri already showed us beautifully there a graph on the aging farming population, and that is a trend that is continuing. In fact, he showed a number that I didn't have, which was more recent, and now that there is 36% of farmers are over the age of 55, and a very small percentage are younger than 35, and that trend has been going on for more than a decade now. And again, Indonesia is not alone. It happens everywhere around the world. Then I just want to mention briefly unsustainable practices. We we need to worry about environmental sustainability, especially in Indonesian context, especially in Indonesia's lowlands of Sumatra, Kalimantan, and Papua. So I know I'm running out of time.
Doing well. One more minute.
One more minute. And what in my mind this calls for is rethinking trade and investment policy, creating an enabling environment for the modernization of agriculture. This country needs competitive markets, and that means reducing production and value chain cost, increasing connectivity, blocking imports to stimulate exports doesn't work. Vietnam and Cambodia, for example, have done much better in that regard. There's a potential here that is simply unexploited. This means support is needed to stimulate farm diversification, technology adoption. I would argue that technology actually exists. The new varieties exist, but it's the dissemination that is really the problem, and that is really very difficult as well. No finger pointing to anyone. It's a tough nut to crack. Market linkages as well. The whole value chain, to meet that challenge of the future and the ongoing changing food system that we just talked about earlier, to meet that requires private investment. It requires the development of complex value chains where competition should be tough, but where digital technology can play a big role, e-commerce can play a huge role, as we've seen in other countries also, for example, China with Alibaba and so on.
Okay, I'm going to stop you at that.
And if I may just finish with one
20 seconds.
With one 20-second recommendation. To do all this, it is time that we think about how to reorient farm support programs that exist. How can we reorient the vast resources that go to the agriculture food sector? In other words, repurposing, shifting away from perhaps fertilizer subsidies to more targeted fertilizer interventions, supporting a new generation of farmers with other things, perhaps including fertilizer, but also other things that would bring about a kind of a momentum of change that is needed to meet the demands of the next decades to come.
Thank you, Jan. And also thank you for raising the issue of overnutrition. It's not just a Western problem, it's happening here in Indonesia. So if we've got some time, we might come back to this obesity issue. If I could move to Robert now, then we'll finish off with the Deputy Minister. Robert, let's go back to the undernutrition, the malnutrition issue. We still have so many people, so many children waking up hungry and going to bed hungry each day. Could you give us some insights in terms of what the United Nations in Indonesia is doing to address this issue, some specific insights? And as I said, if we have time, we might come back and also talk about the obesity issue. Thanks, Robert. Just 3 to 4 minutes.
Great, thanks very much. I think as you pointed out and was pointed out earlier today, that Indonesia really is facing sort of a triple form of malnutrition. So we have stagnant rates of undernutrition, we have rapidly increasing rates of overnutrition, and we continue to have significant levels of micronutrient deficiencies, notably seen in the form of anemia. I think the impact is cutting across all aspects of the life cycle, across all different quintile groups, but it has specific impacts on children and young people, and I think this is a reason for interest and concern by UNICEF. I think some of the statistics that we've already heard about 7 million stunted children, 2 million wasted children, but also a newer trend here is in terms of the numbers of overweight children to which you were alluding to, and we're having over 2 million overweight children, and I think as we go out every day we sort of see more and more evidence of larger numbers of children who are overweight. So there are a variety, I think, of things that are taking place. I think recognizing that this is an issue that starts in the earliest days of the life cycle from infant and young child feeding, which contribute to all of these different pieces, not just in terms of contributing to issues related to undernutrition or malnutrition, but also contributing to later forms of obesity and overweight that occur in children as well. I think the statistics have basically shown that a very small proportion, less than half of children under 5 are fed a diverse diet, which is, I think, contributing again to both forms of undernutrition as well as to overnutrition. We know that the period of exclusive breastfeeding, which also has a major role to play in terms of reducing obesity in later life, is on average about 3 months instead of 6 months for exclusive breastfeeding, which is taking place in Indonesia. We know that this has been exacerbated in some cases by the private sector in terms of some of the marketing practices that have taken place in terms of promoting breast milk substitutes. But we also realize that sort of the relevant knowledge and attitudes by healthcare workers, by caregivers, and by others who are in a position to basically play a role in ensuring good quality nutrition for children is often lacking and is not sufficient. And so these are areas in which we are trying to address. I think getting back to your point about sort of the rising levels of obesity, I think that this is something that has been particularly frightening and particularly alarming in many different areas. It's been fueled by various different causes. I think the levels of availability of healthy food are often absent in terms of going to stores, and I think as you were mentioning earlier in terms of the high price of quality foods, which I think is not a problem just in Indonesia, but in many places. In order to eat healthy, you need to have additional resources to be able to afford to be able to eat healthy, and I think that is an issue which continues to impact many on the lower income levels, is that they're unable to actually afford healthier food. But it's also, I think, that there's a greater promotion for a lot of the types of food that are unhealthy. in terms of product placement, in terms of what is available, and some of the different pieces related to that. Relates to food, relates to some of the sweetened beverages as well. Some of the things that we've also found is that, for example, I think was talked about the issues of consumption of fruits, for example. And I think one of the statistics that has come out is that over half adolescents have fruit less than 1 day per month. And so again, I think these are alarming statistics that point to a lack of diversity of the diet, but also in terms of unhealthy eating, and those calories are obviously being replaced by some of the others. So I think some of the things that you asked we were doing, just to sum up a little bit, is that I think trying to support some of the infant and young child feeding capacity. One of the things that we'd really like to do is to work with BAPPENAS and the Ministry of Health to really scale up the integrated management of acute malnutrition. I think this is a significant contribution. The evidence is very clear about its effectiveness and its ability to promote healthier outcomes. But unfortunately, we haven't reached the level of scale that we would like to have across the country. So that's something that we would really like to address in that particular area. I think another area is in terms of sort of the quality of nutrition for adolescents. And I think we talked about that in terms of the lack of diversity of diet, many of them skipping breakfast and going straight and supplementing a good breakfast with other pieces. So that's another area that we'd like to do, but also to look at the quality of the food that is delivered within schools. And I think looking at the cafeterias, for example, often what is on offer tend to be chocolate bars and tend to be other pieces because there's no sort of regulatory framework that has been put in place to really ensure that the quality of food that is available for that. We've seen some very impressive models, actually a model where young people actually started their own canteen and cafeteria, and the quality of the food that was being offered by those young people was in stark contrast to what was being offered by some of the others. So these are some of the different pieces we're looking to do. We're looking at doing some studies in terms of availability of food that is available in communities, what kind of marketing approaches are available for that, and to have a better understanding about the quality of food that's available in cafeterias and to promote the quality of food that's on offer there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robert. And I was working here in the mid-90s and working for Nokia, and we'd have in the office for breakfast whole foods and fruits, and somewhere between the end of 96 and 97 we started to see donuts entering the menu in the office. There was a Starbucks that opened in the lobby, and that for me was about the tipping point, and we've clearly got some issues to address there, but thank you. The final question before we open up to the audience for the Deputy Minister, could you please let us know your top priorities in the RPJMN in the context of ending hunger and malnutrition? So the top priorities in the RPJMN in the context of ending hunger and malnutrition. Thanks, Punk. Are we working? No. Karaoke style.
Well, if you look at the RPGMN, basically that's aligned with the SDGs as mentioned by Pak Rudi earlier. First of all, if you look at the index, for example, the Global Hunger Index, the index for Indonesia has declined, meaning that the stunting, wasting, also child mortality, which is mainly caused by the lack of food, has been declining. So we are better off in terms of intake in that sense. And then, so what we do related to the SDG number 2 to end hunger is basically on the side of the nutrition. If we talk about hunger, then usually traditionally we talk about undernutrition, not overnutrition. Even though this is very closely linked between these two, but I'm talking about undernutrition. So our main agenda for the RPGMN is focusing on the first day, 1,000 days of life. Why? Because the human capital is very hot issues here in Indonesia, especially now. It's easier for us to communicate the undernutrition as issue of human capital instead of issue of health. It's no wonder now if the president, the vice president, even 20 ministers are also talking about stunting, because the consensus is on the human capital. We know that we always talking about demographic bonus. Demographic bonus will happen in the next 15 years, for example, if the quality of human resources, which is primarily determined by the nutrition status in the early years was not good. So our main goals is to reduce stunting and wasting, especially among children under 2. That's the main goals. But if you look at the way, the logical framework that we agreed upon to reduce stunting, then we know that the stunting is not a standalone problem. If you trace back, then the problem will, you will cover that the problem of stunting is also the problem of anemia among pregnant mothers, and then the problems of lack of water and sanitations, which is quite wide, but that's true. And then also the problem of infections. So undernutrition is not only caused by the inadequate intake of nutrition, but because of infections. And if you trace back again, for example, among the poor, there are 50% of the populations of the poor, the 20% poorest, they're having their under 5s suffer from stunting, for example. So we then from this we can understand that there is something to do with income. But if you look at the 20% richest populations, then you will find out that 30% of their under 5s also suffer from malnutrition. So which is then adequate intake of nutrition is only one thing. So that's why in our logical frameworks on reduced malnutrition, inadequate intakes is one side, but then we have to also empower other sectors to make sure that all the factors that influencing the reduction of stunting has been taken care of. So if you look at logical frameworks are very complex, involving 20 ministries, which is very, very difficult, including, of course, now we are happy that Minister of Agriculture are also on board, which is, I think is very important, especially if you're talking about overnutrition. So the requirements of malnutrition is quite different between the undernutrition and malnutrition. So for example, for undernutrition, the food that is mostly needed is protein food, protein source food. Right? So high energy food, high protein food is okay. I mean, in fact, that's the requirements for the children under 2. But if you're looking at the problem of obesity, the problem is entirely going in different directions. You cannot provide a lot of fruit and vegetable to under 2, but you should provide a lot of fruit and vegetable for us, adult, right? So this is the approach that we have. So going back to your questions, our main goals for ending hunger is on reducing stunting and wasting. But we also, I think if you go into RPGMNs, there are some other influencing factor in reducing stunting, which is the environmental factors. As Jan said, one of the main goal for RPGM is also increasing the farmers' terms trade, which is relating to the capability, the productivity of the farmers to produce the quality food. And then quality and safety also one of our priority. And then of course, if you look at the number 2 priority in our RPGMN is infrastructures. Well, infrastructure is important because I think as Stephen said, that value chain is very important. A lot of foods are lost and waste along the way. And I think we have a discussion previously, if we can handle this loss and waste during the line from farm to tables, probably we don't need to increase the productions, because I think the figure from FAO is about 30% food are lost waste during the way. So increasing 30% is very huge. I mean, keeping 30% on the system is already helping a lot in terms of reducing stunting, especially for those who are in the eastern part of Indonesia, and some area that's main problem of stunting is inadequate on nutrition. But if you go to the urban area, probably that's not the problem. The problem is more on behaviors, on habit of their parents in taking care of their children. So I hope I can answer this question.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for about one question from the audience. So if there's a question out there, I know there's 200 people here, so we're just going to take one. You could either direct it to the panel, or if you want to direct it to either of the three gentlemen for the international agencies, that's fine. But if you could just introduce yourself, and we have really just 3 minutes to wrap this up. Do we have any questions? I can't see the light. No questions. I think that's okay. I just asked the gentleman on stage, do you have any questions of each other, either intra-agency or towards the public policy side of things? Stephen, I suspect you may have one.
Well, the context we have of shifting prices of commodities is a real problem. We are in a market environment. We can't control prices. Efforts to control prices in the past have hit all sorts of problems. Huge expense to government to defend prices. For some of the more internationally traded commodities, which are driving many parts of the smallholder sector, that's something which I find at the macro level, the bank looks across this as an economic prospect for the sector. And I'm always struggling with what is the role of government to intervene at the policy level around prices of commodities. And Jan, I challenge you to maybe come back on that a little bit. What from your side, and also from the government perspective, what do you see the medium-term perspective for some of these crucial commodities in terms of price? I'm talking about farm gate price and also consumer price.
Right. So what comes to mind first is rice as a commodity to me, and probably to many of you as well. And the term strategic commodities, there's probably a good case for having some very key strategic commodities, where you could argue we should try to take out the volatility in prices. And it's not just the story. You're right. It's not just the story of reducing food prices for consumers. It's a story of making sure that supply and demand are met, and that there's no sudden, unexpected problems there. And so there are mechanisms that can do that. There could be a case for some remaining influence or intervention by the government, while at the same time allowing the rice sector to become simply more efficient and more effective. And that requires an active private sector participation. And once you have that effective mechanism, an effective market, farmers also stand to benefit. There's no doubt in my mind that farmers stand to benefit. And I think when it comes to income, farm income, maybe just as the devil's advocate here, I would argue that if we think that we should promote rice production and focus on rice production for farm income, we're on the wrong track, because rice doesn't make money, not much anyway. And no matter what you do with your value chain, maybe you can improve it, but in my mind, a farmer could be much better off doing not only rice, but also other things. Irrigation infrastructure, water, expensive water could be utilized for other crops, for high-value crops. That would also serve the purpose of nutritional diversification in the marketplace. Those are just my quick thoughts on your question.
Or rice fish.
Okay.
The list goes on.
Did you want to mention? Yeah.
I would like to respond to that very interesting questions. Actually, in our medium-term plans, we also talking about the price, and I think two solutions, as I remember, because it is not my portfolio, is how to reduce the logistical costs. I mean, this is very important because the price is very high because you need money handling for transport and handling. And then second, I think this technology can take a role is to reduce the middlemen. There are a lot of middlemen here in Indonesia, and then the change from the productions up to the consumer is quite long, and a lot of profit takings happens along the way. I mean, this is the role of technology when can you close the producers and consumers. But I'm try to respond in different way. If you talk about price, it does not necessarily that the lower price is good. This is the case for some because we're talking about healthy diets here. We are talking about obesity, for example. There are a lot of food that are quite cheap. That's why there are countries that introducing syntax into sugary foods, because they are contributing to obesity. So easy access to that kind of foods can encourage unhealthy diets as well. So the things that we need to consider. I mean, it depends on what kind of foods and what kind of problem you take care. Of course, for the children who suffer from stuntings, then the affordable food is quite important. I think the challenge for private now is that can we provide the food that is affordable, yet is nutritious and balanced diets. I mean, there are a lot of food that is cheap, but nutrition is not really balanced diet. I mean, it's not the food that you are required to address the stunting. But they are very good source of food, but it's expensive because it's manufactured. So now, then the challenge is how can we introduce or innovate the food that's affordable to the poor, but yet nutritious and have a balanced compositions in it.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up at this point. We've got a coffee break of 20 minutes now. I notice there's some sugar-coated donuts out there. Please don't touch those. Apply some lack of market demand. Please join me in thanking the panel for their insightful and honest comments. Thank you. Okay, we'll get you later on, Stephen. You've got your own show.